So before lunch, we started off talking about where you want to get to. And so that's quality of life, and that's your financial goal. And then we talked about once you know where you want to get to, how are you going to get there? How are you going to sell that? We talked about a marketing plan, what you grow, choosing profitable crops. And then we figured out how you're going to grow that stuff. And that kind of brings us, that's the big planning piece that we've done. Now, I want to talk about scale at this point. I also want to talk about record keeping, then a bit about keeping your plan on track. I don't have specific slides, but I would like to talk a bit about crop rotation also in this. So that's kind of what's planned for the afternoon. We'll take a break around 2:30ish if we can make it to that far. And I think we'll have some time near the end, the last hour and a half, to kind of talk about more general stuff that might not have been met or might not have been talked about. So are there any questions about this morning that are lingering or stuff that popped up when you were thinking about it over lunch and talking about your spreadsheets? But it's all perfectly crystal clear. All right.
Good question. I think for maybe some of us, it could seem a little overwhelming, especially just starting out for the first time.
Yeah.
So could you speak a little bit to just kind of the process, like how you got through that and how you learned and some of the...
Yeah, and are you talking about planning or are you talking about starting a farm?
No, not about starting a farm. That's why we're all here probably. But specifically like the spreadsheet and kind of the crop planning and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So it can be an overwhelming thing to start a farm. And the crop planning is an important part. And I guess you have to, well, how quick do you want to jump in? And where are you at in your career? Have you worked on other farms and you're ready to be in charge and make your own mistakes and quit making someone else's? Or is this something that you're pivoting towards? Like, these are all things that change. And do you want to be making a lot of money in your first year? Or are you trying to just break even and keep going? And so these are different scenarios. To have the most profitable farm, you take the most advanced work to get there. But there's also a place where you're learning still. And so if you have another job or even working on another farm, and you're planning on starting a farm down the line, growing some crops will give you some experience. And it might just be that you grow a row of tomatoes, you grow a couple rows of carrots and a few things, and you see what it's like. And then you bring some of it and you sell it to maybe your coworkers at work, or you go get a market stall a couple weeks and you sell that, or you figure something else out. Maybe you bring it to restaurants and you kind of do a pitch to see who's interested. But you're kind of taking it a little less seriously. It's more as a discovery type thing. And I think if you have the time to do stuff like that, that's really beneficial because you're going to learn some of the information that you'd plug into a spreadsheet. But if you're really jumping into a full year of production where you have to be tight, that's where their planning is really, really important. And so it's a bit of a spectrum where you're going to situate yourself on that. And so when it gets time to the crop planning, you do have to go through crop by crop and make these decisions. Now, some people, that the thought of sitting down with a spreadsheet is like the best thing ever. And you get to look at data in so many different ways. And if that's you, that's more power to you. That part's not going to be the challenge. For other people, it's a real chore. And that's why I say you can do this on computers. You can also do it on paper. They're like, if that's something that makes it easier for you to do. You can also put a big, have a big piece of paper on the wall and scribble things on it. Those are all ways to get to it. But you do have to go through crop by crop and think about when you need it and how much you want. Some of it's fairly easy. Like if you're going to have lettuce every week and you want to have 200 lettuce heads, you kind of get the math once and then you're growing that same amount of lettuce every week. You can also look at if, let's say you're going to grow 30 or 40 different crops, but there's like 10 that are going to be your main crops or 5 that are going to be your main crops. Put emphasis on the most important crops, and then maybe the rest you could grow some extra. And if you're doing a CSA basket, you might want to do more work on all the crops because you really need that diversity. If you're going to farmer's market, maybe what you're doing is you plan the stuff that's your staples that you want to have every week, and then you have some kohlrabi, some celery root, some things that might not be so popular, but you're just going to grow a little bit to see what they're like and have something extra at the farmer's market. And if they don't work, that's great. But you don't grow so many that you're inundated. So that's what I would kind of say is as an approach. But it does take time to make a solid crop planning the first year. And it's because there's so many different things. There's the technical skill of running through a spreadsheet, which might be intimidating. But then there's also knowing what are the planting dates, how early, like what crops can take being frost and what can't, and what you want to do every 2 or 3 weeks, and what you want to do every week. Like all those decisions, they become paralyzing in the sense that they're in a crop plan, but it's not just because they're in a crop plan. Like you have to ask them because that's how you're going to plan. That's how you're going to plant. And so you have to ask yourself that for all those questions one way or the other. And sometimes you can lump things together a little bit, like carrots, beets, turnips. You can kind of plant in a similar way. The harvest is a little bit different, but some of the things the similar way. So the more you can find similarities between crops and approach them in similar functions, the easier it's going to be for yourself. Does that satisfy you? Yeah? Sort of?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Is the question over there?
Concerning that, would you recommend somebody getting, beginning, if you're not into Excel right away, maybe wants to do that, but would it be okay to do crop planning software kind of? Would you recommend that, or just people who get that, or?
I think. So, are you asking, if Excel is not intuitive to you, should you go for a crop planning software instead? Is that the question?
Basically, should you start on one or the other, or just?
I don't think you have to. I don't think that there's one that's better than the other. One thing about using a spreadsheet system like Excel or Google Sheets is that you can often see the math behind the decisions, and understanding that math is part of the learning process. Whereas if you're plugging things into cells and then you get an output, there's part of the process that you have faith that you're putting into the computer, and it might be accurate, but not understand that thought process of understanding kind of helps you visualize it, because ultimately, and this is going back to what I was saying about things being modular and things being simple, is that you are the crop planning software, and you want to be able to see it in your head how it all works out. And so these tools let you, like this or an app, let you process information much quicker, let you do repetitive things, but ultimately you have to be able to balance it in your brain. And yeah. So, I mean, a lot of softwares, apps have trial periods, so you could jump into them, see if you like what it does and what kind of questions they ask, and go with that. You don't want to have the technical aspect be too much the limiting factor that stops you. Yeah. Other thoughts? Question?
I grow a lot of different things. I have a CSA and a lot of different things. And I'm grasping it. I can do Excel, but I'm a little overwhelmed. So I'm thinking, is it a good idea maybe if I don't think I could do this for everything? Because I've already ordered my seeds and everything,
Yeah.
But I'm thinking for lettuce, I want to do a better job with lettuce.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about just doing this for my lettuce crop.
Yep.
To perfect that, and then next year I'll be familiar with the spreadsheet and the process and everything. I could do it for the rest.
You can do a little bit more and more each time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great approach to it. And I think looking at, and that's when at the beginning, when I was showing the example of tomatoes, it's a little bit of an easier question when you have one crop that you grow and harvest for a while of how you do that. But when you're doing a lot of repetitions, that's where some of the details get a bit trickier. And it's easier to grow too much or not enough in each of those stages. I think it's also kind of looking at what makes the most money for your farm and putting the most effort in there is probably a good place to do. And some things, like if garlic is your top crop, crop planning is not a big part of garlic. You know, you're planting at one point. You might want to plan around a marketing plan to figure out how much you need, but to convert that into how many beds, it's going to be pretty easy because it's the one planting. But I think it's really great on your farm to know, like, let's say your top 3 or 4 crops, and to put a lot of attention into those. And so both in terms of planning, but also in terms of monitoring and recording the time that it takes you to do that. Because understanding those, like there was a time when we were smaller where garlic was like 1/6 of our revenue. It's now the same amount of revenue, but our business is much bigger, so it's no longer 1/6. But at that point, for 2 years, we tracked all the time everything we did in the garlic. And after the first year, we realized, like, you see how you're actually spending time. So we had a certain idea, but one of the things we realized is physically hanging the garlic up was taking us as much time as harvesting the garlic. And thinking back, like, oh yeah, that's true. But we hadn't realized that until we saw it on numbers. And so the next year, we changed the way that we hung the garlic up, and it was 1/10 of the time that it took the previous year. And it was such a difference. And then we targeted a few other things that we saw we were taking a lot of time on, and we decided to target those techniques. But we wouldn't have known that had we not been tracking the time for those crops. Now, yes, if you track the time for all your crops, you'll be able to improve them all, but it's hard to do for all of them. So maybe making, if the crop is giving 1/4 of your revenue and you can do it in half the time, that's so much more savings than something that's 1% of your revenue that you do much better. So I think it comes back, so if lettuce is something that's tricky on your farm, you do a lot of lettuce, taking the time to do this specifically for lettuce will let you learn how to crop plan using these kind of tools, and will give you better results. And if the results are better, it'll make you more interested in seeing what you could do with another crop, and encourage you to do more. I'm going to jump back in, and we're going to think about scale. Now, there's a sheet I have here, and this is also in the handouts. And I'm going to go through it, and we'll talk about what happens at different scales of farms. So at the top, I have sub-acre. So that's like less than an acre, you know, 1/3 of an acre, 1/2 an acre. And then a couple acres. And then 2 to 10 acres. And then 10 plus. I know there are farms that are more than 10 acres, and you could have other categories. But I've tried to make it what's kind of in the small farm spectrum. When we were, you know, we think of ourselves as a small farm. You know, we have 5, 6, we have 6 acres of vegetables right now. And I remember at a certain point, we're at our farmer's market, we started being considered the big guys. And I think for some small farms, they could just see us like as a big multinational corporation with our 5 acres of vegetables and 2 farmers markets. And so there's a lot of perception that comes into it. And so you could call this micro, small, medium, large. But this is also all small. And it's all relative. So those titles aren't really that important. But when you're at different scales, you make different decisions. These are what I think are sort of some of the logical decisions that you might make. But there's always exceptions of people who do things that are very different and are successful in it. But it's good to know what would be the best way, or what would be the most logical way to be successful in that. So if you're growing less than an acre of crop, you probably want all your crops to be worth, like each planting, to be worth at least $30,000 an acre. Now you're doing multiple plantings, so that's how you get up to more than $30,000 a total acre. But if the crops are worth less than that, you're losing money, and you shouldn't be growing them on that scale. And that's probably going to mean that you're going to narrow down to a handful of signature crops, and this is what you're focusing on and what you're building your reputation around. In that 1 to 2 acres, you're still trying to do mostly $30,000 an acre crops, but you might be growing more stuff. Diversity might be a little bit more important for your marketing outlets. In that 2 to 10 acres, we always like that 30 plus 30K plus, but you start to have some 20K that comes into it, just to broaden, and it can still be profitable despite having these in it. Whereas if you have a lot of 20,000 an acre in these, you are losing money, but with this, it can start to work. And when you're at 10 plus an acre, the dollars per acre is less the defining thing that's important about your business. It's more about, are you mechanized well? Is labor working well? Like there's all those things become more important than just the dollars per acre. This next column is, do you crop a bed multiple times? So after a crop is finished, do you pull it out or incorporate it and plant something else? And in a sub-acre setting, you do that as much as possible. You want 2, 3, 4, 5 crops in the same bed, one after the other in a year. And that is how you make profit. And if you can't do that, you're probably not going to hit your targets. At 1 to 2 acres, it is good to have that for some of your crops, but you're probably not doing it for all your crops. 2 to 10 acres, it's even more so than this. It becomes harder to do it. And on 10 plus acres, you probably, no I don't. On 10 plus acres, space isn't the limiting factor as much, so you're probably not double cropping. Now, when it gets to terms of marketing, on that sub-acre, you're growing a limited array of crops, and so it's hard to do a CSA. If you just have 5 crops, you could do a CSA, but that's not going to be the strongest way to go. You're more likely dealing with restaurants, stores, or market. And with 1 to 2 acres, you could start having more diversity and have a CSA. You might choose to buy some stuff in like potatoes or squash if it takes more space than you have to give it. But you might not need to buy something in, but you can start to have a CSA at there. 2 to 10 acres, CSA works well and diversity works well. In this top range, pricing is very important for profitability. Getting close to the top dollar for all your crops is what's going to make you be profitable. Down here, I kind of offer better, but I can offer lower pricing. Down here, you can start to have lower pricing either in function of bulk or to define yourself in the market. It's never a good idea to have a race to the bottom in terms of prices with your competitors in a small farm world, because we won't be able to survive, any of us. But like you start offering 5, 10-pound bags of carrots and potatoes, and you can take that price break without it being a problem, because especially at 10 plus acre, volume becomes more important than just the pricing. And whereas up here, you probably see a bunch of signature crops and then a lot of diversity. As you get in 10 plus, you might see less crops again, because it might start to make sense to be mechanizing and growing a less diversity so you grow more well. And maybe you have some diversity on 4 or 5 acres, and then 4 or 5 acres that are 2 or 3 crops. In terms of planning, on these bigger farms, you're often looking at the year very well. And you do a little bit of modifying through the season, but the year is really important. On these smaller farms, especially here, you really have to be keeping track of how things are selling at restaurants and stores, how things are changing, because you don't want to get stuck with product that's no longer desired. So that's changing your cropping mix or your varieties in function of what people are looking for. So it becomes, and the quantity they're looking for. So you're kind of more of a weekly and monthly planning cycle. So there's different ways to look at it. We also haven't talked about mechanization. If you're down here, you probably don't have a tractor. You could, but you probably don't. You might have one. This is frustrating me.
You click the bottom one, it'll stop popping up.
How do this one down here?
Right above the last green arrow, the current colors.
Keep the current. Okay, yeah. Maybe I could bother. I didn't actually read what it was saying. I just didn't like it.
Why does it do that?
It wants to be in charge.
Yeah. Okay. So At the smaller acreage, you probably don't have a tractor. Here, there are people who don't have tractors, but most people do have tractors. And up here, I think the majority of people have tractors at this point. It gets easier to mechanize weeding as you get bigger. As you get smaller, it's often your planting is denser, so it's harder to mechanize it. So those are some differences. Now, there's something that's, when I started farming, we had Elliot Coleman as a role model. And I mean, there was tons of other farmers at conferences and a lot of people that were inspirational, but in terms of published books, there was Elliot Coleman, and Growing for Market had just been published or started to be written. So there was some stuff, but not as much now. And now there are some, especially on the lower end, there's a lot of models that you can look at. So there's J.M. Fortier, Jean Martin, who wrote a book, The Market Gardener. I'm assuming some of you have heard of him. Most have heard of him. So he farms outside of Montreal also, and he's at 1.5 acres, and they have a CSA as the core of their farm. I don't know if it's 150 or 180 CS members. They also have a side business where they do salad greens, but they're kind of fairly diverse, but they have no tractor. And that's kind of like this kind of model of a lot of different crops. Someone like Curtis Stone, the urban farmer. Anybody here about him? So he's growing something like 1/3 of an acre. I mean, the numbers change after year, but kind of I think when he was becoming more popular, it was like about 1/3 of an acre, producing $60,000 on that, and growing a lot of lettuce, some tomatoes, radishes. It's a select group of crops.
Doesn't he fit in a couple of categories? It's like 1/3 of an acre in like 6 different yards.
Well.
Doesn't he rents yards from other people?
Yeah,
too, right?
but he's actually even started to buy out his neighbors, and I think he's actually dropped other fields, and he's just in his backyards. But it's still 1/3 of an acre total is what he's doing, even when he's doing different yards. And so he's really here, a bunch of signature crops, focusing. He's dropped out of market. Now he's phasing out of restaurants and just doing grocery stores almost. And there's NeverSink. If people hear about NeverSink, so I think there's something are they maybe a little bit over an acre? And they claim to be making something like $300,000 an acre. And so what's interesting in some of those, I don't know the NeverSink people as much, but I think pricing might be part of what they're doing. So they're growing in greenhouses. They're north of New York City. I think they might actually be going into the city. So there's maybe prices you can get that you can't get in other places. They also they grow a lot of different stuff, a lot more diverse than you would think, but they focus on growing stuff when people don't have it. So if you have potatoes in March, you get a better price than if you have potatoes in September. And that's a big part of their profitability. There's other parts too, but that's a big part. But pricing, it's very easy to look at these models and think the pricing is the secret. And Jean Martin often gets comment on that his pricing. He has great prices because that's out of Montreal. We actually have some of the lowest vegetable prices in Canada. Like when I look at in Alberta or even in Ottawa, like there's much higher prices. And so it's not, you can have not top prices and still survive in these kinds of markets if you're doing a lot of the other stuff well. But pricing definitely can make a difference going from medium to really big. Yeah, ourselves, we're kind of in this area. Yeah. Any thoughts about scale?
Do you, what's the breakdown on your farm of the 20K per acre to 30K per acre?
That's a great question. So our farm, let's go to the other board. I'm going to get rid of these safety factors. I think we've grappled with that enough. So on our farm, we have 6 acres. This big 6-acre field. I know it's broken down. We do have a greenhouse. We probably have something like 1/2 acre under greenhouses. And then we have, so we'll call it greenhouses. And then we have probably another 1/2 acre under caterpillar tunnels. Caterpillar tunnels are structures usually about 14 feet wide, and it's a series of arches like this. And then there's like a T-stake in the ground, some plastic that's tied to it and then kind of wrapped over it. And then you'll have like a ground anchor in the ground, screwed on each side, and you have a rope that's wrapped around it. There are different models of it, but it's a very low-tech form of tunnel. There's different ways that you can push the plastic up to hold it in, but they're easier to move, and we actually move ours every year. So we have a Caterpillar tunnel, so this is half, and then this is something like 5 acres of other vegetables. And these Caterpillar tunnels, it's this half acre, might be 60K that we're producing. So if you look at an acre, that's like 120K. Actually, maybe almost the greenhouse might be the same kind of thing. And what this is, or the greenhouse is, we don't actually grow tomatoes in our greenhouse. We grow early crops and late crops so that we can still have things even though it's cold. And so, a couple successions of lettuce, microgreens, or other things that make up this. This is tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, basil, that are very profitable crops. And then the rest here is something between 30 and 50K. Maybe like some 25K if you look at, we have a bit of broccoli, we grow a bit of beans and peas. And we do that because we want diversity in the CSA basket. We buy some broccoli in, or try to, it's just never available when we want it. But so I hate building Caterpillar tunnels, but then I look at what it's producing. I would love to have another half acre in that. But you have to have the market to do it. And the market isn't always there to meet your needs. And so in some ways, this is kind of really like outside. When we look at outside on our farm, it's like this 2 to 10 acres. When you look at these, they're more like the sub-acre that we're managing it. And I think that when you build greenhouses, there's a lot of cost, both in labor to put it up and just the physical, the money cost of materials. And so you have to be able to use it for the most that you can use it. The more you use it, the more money you make out of it, the more it better return on your investment. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you're saying the 60K for the half acre, you're kind of getting that by doing the multiple croppings in the greenhouse?
Yeah.
How you're kind of doing that?
In this case, yes, and in this case, it's by tomatoes, peppers, eggplants.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And so I should just write here, like this is like 120K an acre. This is 120K an acre. And then here, this is something like 30 to 50K an acre. And so it's one of the things that I find really interesting, looking like at something that Jean Martin is doing. Per planting, their crops are the same thing. A lettuce planting for them is like $30,000 to $40,000 an acre. A lettuce planting for us is $30,000 to $40,000 an acre. We just happen to do one lettuce planting in the field and not follow it up with anything else, whereas they'll do 2 lettuce plantings or so. When he was at Lac-Guillemette and another new farm project he had Tretan, they might even do 2 or 3 things afterwards. And that's the difference. It's the multiple cropping. It's not the specific crop itself that makes the difference. Is that clear? Yeah. In all cases, the farms that are doing successful have good systems also and have a good way of thinking about how they work through things. Yep.
So how do you communicate your crop plan? Because you have work essentially from week to week to all those different parts on the farm. Like what's the process in terms of communicating?
How do I communicate to staff, or how do I communicate?
Yes.
So all of this is in one spreadsheet like we just looked at. So it's all the crops are in there for all the different dates. They're divided by blocks and beds. And so you can filter through and look at which things you want to look at in a specific week.
Staff is looking through the spreadsheets?
We give staff, they have access to the spreadsheets.
Okay.
And human resources are a really important part of a farm's success. And the more you can empower your staff to think and make decisions, the happier they'll be. There's other things that make them happy too, but that really empowering them to be able to do stuff is really, like, it makes them happy. It also takes work off of your head, out of your head. And that's something that there's so much things to do. Anything you can take out is really great. And even if they make occasional mistakes, that's better than it being in your head, because you'll make occasional mistakes on some stuff if you're having to do too many things at the same time. And it's possible that if they have a smaller list of things that they're trying to do, they're going to get better at it than you are. And so we do let the staff use the spreadsheets and take ownership. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Who here has aspirations of being a sub-acre farmer? Got 2, 3, 4, 5 hands. How about the 1 to 2 acres? Who does that speak to? How about this? Okay, a lot of you in this area. How about this? Is this too small for some of you? Or is it? Yeah. Okay. Hmm?
In one spot here?
Yeah. Okay. So there's place for all of us at the farming table, and there's also place for you to prove me wrong about what fits in these columns. These are just generalizations. Yeah.
One question, Dan.
Yeah.
So, in order to achieve those numbers, you have to be sure that you have the people got the customers in order to buy them.
Yes, you have to, yes, to get these numbers, you have to sell the product. Otherwise, it's just a spreadsheet with plans, you know. And that's exciting, but it's also intimidating. And there are people out there to buy the stuff, but just you have to find them, and it can take time. Yeah.
Here, for example, Bloomington, I don't know if you're familiar with this area, Indiana.
Mhm.
Bloomington has probably one of the biggest farmers markets in the state.
Yeah.
Maybe the biggest. So, of course, that's great because there are so many, farmers bringing their produce.
Yeah.
But also at the same time, there's so many people buying.
Yeah.
So the competition is a big issue there.
Yeah.
Farmers market. So you could achieve that or even more, but you have to have, several smaller people buying.
Yeah. One thing to remember is this is a ratio. This is not $30,000 that you're actually making. It's, you have a bed of something or you have a part of a bed that you're planting, and it comes out to this ratio. So you could, my garden could be this big, but I'm selling at this ratio, My garden could be much bigger, but I'm selling at this or a smaller ratio. So that's something to understand. And it's, when you're starting off, you don't totally know where your market's going to be, but it's dangerous to grow much more than you can sell because it's a lot of resources to do it. So it's definitely a chicken-egg kind of situation of, do you grow enough or without the market, or how do you work that out? And ultimately, it's hard to think this way when you're starting out, but this is just 1 year. There are many more years coming, and so at the end of the year, you're able to look back and you have a new year and plan, and it's hard when you're in a startup mode to really see that longer term view, and because we're all in it for the long term. We're not doing this to build something that we're going to sell off and get rich off of. Like, we're doing this for something that we want to keep doing down the line. And so you take the time to build it well so that it works. And you commented about competition at farmers markets, and there is competition at farmers markets. And you might get some nasty looks if you start being a new vendor at these places. Don't dump products onto the market. Don't try to undercut on price, because that can make you even nastier looks, and you probably won't be making tons of money. But markets change in how over time, and one thing about being a new market at a vendor is usually you don't have the biggest lines, and you don't like that because you want the biggest lines. But it means that the people with the biggest lines can't necessarily meet everybody's needs, so some people don't want to wait in line and they come to you. And they buy something and they start chatting and they start to hear about your story, and they do that 3 or 4 times in a row, 3 or 4 weeks in a row, and then they start to become your clients. And I find in a lot of farmers markets there are farmer clients who want to spread their food dollars over a number of vendors, and not just buy from one person. They want to support everybody. And so that helps new growers. And farmers markets can also be a place to start, like if you have no other connections, you start there, but you start to build your community, and maybe you start a CSA through some of these people in another area, or you use it as a, you can meet restaurant owners or other things through that. Like it's your outlet to the world. That's, the cost is you sitting there and selling vegetables. Yeah. Okay. Any more thoughts about scale?
Is that Canadian dollars?
It can be. Depends how you want it to be. I find a lot of the prices are the same. I guess it depends where you are, but a lot of prices are the same in Canadian. Like the actual number is the same whether it's Canadian or U.S. dollars. And yeah, but I'm not sure about Indiana prices. I know more like kind of New England prices, so I'm not sure. Like how much would a bunch of carrots go for at a market?
$3-4.
$3-4? That's kind of the same place as where we are in Montreal, but in Canadian dollars. Yeah. Somewhere like Ottawa, which is only 2 hours away from us, it's $4 to $5 for a bunch. There was a while it was $5, but then the market sort of had a hard time, and it then dropped down a little bit. So,
I feel like $5 in the winter.
well, the winter's a different beast, but in terms of the summer, sometimes there's new markets that come into areas that have more disposable income, and there's definitely a desire to cash in on that. But if there's multiple markets in the same city and some are higher priced, eventually there's sort of an evening out that can happen, unless you really want to keep that niche of people. Some people like to spend more for things than other people, but it can be difficult to feed.
Well, in certain areas, they become suspicious as to why it's not more.
That's another. That could be another thing. Yeah, is that a problem?
My husband makes copper jewelry.
Okay.
And we were initially selling at the price that we do in this area, and nobody touched it until we marked the prices up, and then they started buying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it was the famous life.
It creates a value when you pay more for something. You care about it more when you pay more for it. It's, unfortunate to talk about food that way because we all need food to eat and to survive. But
If you want to pay extra, it's fine.
yeah, yeah. Well, not everybody can afford to, and that is we're not going to tackle that one in this one specifically, but it is a challenge, and that's something that some people have that as part of their mandate to figure out how to do that. And one thing that there's a CSA that's not that far from us that let's say they're in their basket, there's $30 of vegetables per basket. And when you sign up, you can pay $20 or you can pay $40, but you can't pay $30. And their goal is to have some people who wished, and they're associated with the charity also, so they're able to do charitable receipts for the amount over that $30, but they want people to recognize where they sit in terms of wealth, and if this is one way that they can help other people eat. So there's different tools that we can do. It is tough. Like, I get asked all the time by people about, like, what do I do for food security? And not that that's not an important question, but it's often the farmer that's asked that. And we're not the ones who are making the big dollars, And you don't get the same thing asked of, like, if you sell cell phones, someone doesn't ask you, what do you do for food security? But it's a question all of us should be grappling with. And it's not just because we produce food doesn't mean that we have the whole responsibility of solving a broken food system. We just happen to be aware of it, and we just happen to be part of the thing that's not benefiting necessarily from it. And it's important to not, like, yes, you should have a social conscience, but you shouldn't. You got to be careful how guilty you feel about charging the prices you need, but you also want to find a way to support the world that you want to live in. So, but that's another talk. Yeah. So records. Who loves record keeping? So
Said the finance people.
now we're here as vegetable farmers, but it's very easy to become data farmers. And what happens when you sow those data seeds? And that's something, and I'm saying this sarcastically, but what are records for? Any of those avid record keepers or non-record keepers want to say why we keep records?
Historical analysis.
Historical analysis? Taxes?
For fun.
For fun. The most fun. I'm going to have to ask you to repeat that. Find areas to improve on? Yeah.
Planning.
Hmm?
Planning.
Planning? Anybody certified organic?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they love records. Yeah. So those are all reasons that you might be what? Keeping records for. Sorry, my brain is running out here. Now here are a few. So I like the answer of figuring out where you can improve. Like that's something that I think records are at their best. Sometimes related to taxes or organic certification, you have specific record requirements. I don't know taxes want necessarily to know exactly where you got this head of lettuce from in your field, but your certifier might know. And that's something that if you choose to reduce your record keeping, you have to talk with them to find out what they need to make sure that they'll let you keep your certification. But when we're talking about, so you can keep records on all kinds of stuff. But when it comes to harvest records, what I think you really want is to learn about yields. And the way you learn about yields is you keep track of what you're harvesting. But at a certain point, you know what your yields can be. So if you've been keeping track of your records for 2 or 3 years, and you know that on average you get 2.5 bunches of carrots in a bed foot, you now know this. And so when you keep tracking yields at that point, or records at that point, you're not learning a new thing. At that point, maybe you're starting to monitor your yields to see how they are. Now, if you're doing that in real time, so you see that, oh, the beds that we've been harvesting in the last week or two, their yields are less than others, that's fantastic. If you're doing it in December, and you see that in September or in May, these beds had half the yield, what are you going to do about it in December? So if it's in May that you're not getting your yields, you can. What is it? Is it that it rained too much? It didn't rain enough? Your cedar was at the wrong density? You could figure out what that is and change it. But in December, there's no way to control what you're changing. And so, if you are able to monitor your yields in real time and look at that, that's phenomenal. Most people don't look at it that way. What's more important is to be, when you're harvesting, to say, oh, this isn't a great bed. And to ask yourself, why isn't it a great bed? And what can I do different to make sure it's better? And you don't necessarily need to have data to do that. So what I would question is, if you've been farming for a while and you're keeping records of everything you do, is it worthwhile doing it? Now, sometimes you add a new crop. You have new varieties. You're trying out some new cherry tomatoes, and yield is an important part. So maybe you track the yields that year, and you add a couple controls in, that varieties you love, to compare them with. But when you do this all the time, tracking everything, it takes up a lot of labor, your labor or your staff's labor. And it's labor that could be done in something else. Now, yeah, what do you think about that?
I love that idea.
I hate records. Let's look at what record keeping can look like. Okay. So at basic, this is what you're trying to get out of a harvest record. You want to know when it was harvested. You want to know what the crop was and what the variety was. You want to know what kind of unit. I know the columns have repeated here. Where it's come from and the quantity. Now, there's a few things in here. Do you want to know the variety? You might. If you're trying to decide between different tomatoes, you want to know the variety of tomatoes. But if you're just trying to keep track of what your total harvest is, because that's what your certifier wants, maybe you keep track of all the kill together. So there's different things about what level of detail you want. So this is done, so it'd be done during as you're what, through the year. Okay, let's just, okay, second. Where's that sheet here? I'm going to show how we, that was F11, right? Not F10, which I've learned that I stopped the recording before lunch, and that wasn't very popular. So this is not what I'm looking for. This is what I'm looking for. So we've set up a Google spreadsheet online, a Google form, kind of like a SurveyMonkey type thing, to keep track of stuff. So the way harvest works on our farm is Emily, who's also my wife, is the harvest manager on the farm, and she runs the harvest crew. And so in the morning, she comes out with a list of what we're harvesting that day, and she gives a list to everybody. And on that, there's the crop and how much we need of each crop. And she assigns people to the different crops. And there's a harvest leader for each crop. Sometimes the harvest leader has 3 or 4 crops. And then they go out with their team, they harvest the stuff, and then they record what they harvested and from where. They go through the day. After they're back to the barn, at some point during the day, they're expected to go into this sheet and enter the information. And once it's done, they take that sheet and they put it into a filed area. And this is ideally, this is how it works. Things don't always work out the way we hope they do. And so when they're filling it out, so they could say, Dan harvested this. This was block 201. Maybe this was bed 13. Tab changes. So we have this thing, what wave? It's especially important if more than one planting in the same crop in the same bed. There's no wave here. Code we don't really use, but something we're moving towards because spelling makes a difference. So having a short code can be quicker than and getting it accurate than having spelling carrots with 1, 2, or 3 R's, depending how you're feeling. So, okay, okay, let's go back up. So the crop name, carrot, crop variety. If you're tracking it or if you're not tracking it, the amount harvested, we harvested 200 of them. And what were they? So are the units, is the bunches, the kilograms? Let's say we did bunches in this case. And then this is an important part that we have is there's a question that is, what will the next harvest be like? This is because Emily can't go and see everything, so she wants to know roughly the same. So we just wiped out all the carrots we have. There's going to be no more. And then we have, this is an optional thing, total harvest time. Sometimes we'll ask specifically to record this so we can get an idea of what rates are like. And then sometimes we'll also figure out the bed feet, but usually we're not putting that information. And then there's an area of anything else you'd like to share. You know, there's a lot of disease. Yeah, it could be anything. And then you submit. So, and then we submit another response. So the person transfers into the spreadsheet. And then what happens with this is the back end. So at on February 28 at 1:54, Dan entered something from block 201, bed 13. It was carrots. There was no name, 200 bunches. The next harvest will be none, and there's nothing else he'd like to share.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
On your bunches, do you actually know how many are in a bunch so that you know exactly, like when you put bunch, there's 10 in a bunch or something like that? Does that track that?
How many carrots are in a bunch?
Like 10, say 10 or something.
Well, we know what a bunch is. You know, it's a bunch on our farm.
Yeah.
So that's a question of what are you going to do with this data afterwards? And so with this data, we can use some different sheets to kind of summarize. We could do a pivot on this if everybody spelled carrot the right way and see how many bunches, kilograms, and stuff were done. And we can figure out yields that way. In terms of how many bunches in our carrot, like if your bunch size varies dramatically through or how many carrots in a bunch, if your bunch size varies dramatically through the year, that might be worth knowing. But generally, a bunch is a bunch is a bunch. And maybe your pricing changes. Maybe your early season carrots are different than your midsummer, or different from the ones that are growing in a greenhouse. But your bunch is still a bunch. And so that's why we use bunch. You know, we could, at another point, let's say for a certifier wants to know the total number of carrots that we did, and we know that we had 7,000 bunches, that we did as bunches and we did 2,000 pounds as bulk, maybe we could estimate that each bunch is like a pound. So because that 7,000 bunches is 7,000 pounds. So there's ways to kind of convert that for that. And for the certifier's needs, or if, I don't know if you guys have to do, like in Canada through the StatsCan, will contact us to kind of figure out just to catch what we've harvested, so you know, province and stuff, trends. But for that kind of purpose, that's close enough. Yeah.
I was just curious because like a bunch of carrots could be a different amount than a bunch of onions or, you know. like,
Right.
you know,
Yeah,
so
but it's really in terms of bunches of carrots that we're doing. We're looking at here. We're looking at the crop, what a bunch would be. Yeah. What's really important also is that you train your staff so they know what a bunch of carrots is. And yeah, and they can distinguish between the carrots and the beets most of the time. Yeah.
Depends on your staff.
Depends on your staff. You might want to work on your hiring, or you might want to work on your training, because who's the problem?
I have a quick question for you.
Yep.
Do you, the technological piece of connecting those two, do you know how that works? We already use a Google system.
Yep.
So I would be interested in how you actually connected the survey to the Excel sheet, if you happen to know.
So, okay, this is the back end of the survey. There's here the questions, and you write them down. You click this as responses. There's this little button here, and you click on it. And, well, so, okay, let's click on the little hamburger. So select response destination, and you click on that, and responses are currently being sent to this spreadsheet, or you can create a new spreadsheet. If there's no spreadsheet, it'll just create a new one for you. And so that just happens normally. Like, it's just how it's linked together. Yeah. This,
The initial survey came from where?
I made it. But like, so if you were to go into Google Drive, you go to plus new, and then I go to more. I choose a form. And maybe I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller. I don't know if we're still at, so people can see a bit more. But here it is, and what is the survey for? You know, you could, I don't know what this is about. It's an untitled form, and you can have your question, and you could choose what kind of questions you want, and then, so what kind of answers you want. So you write the question, but you could have it a paragraph, or you can choose it as a multiple choice or checkbox. This one can be required or not. If you have it as a short answer, you could click on this, and then you do response verification. It has to be a number greater than, or you could choose equal to, less than. You know, you can control what the information is, because you don't want somebody to write how many carrots did we do, and they write just W. You know, it's a lot, too much. So that's important. You can keep that for the last thing of things you want to share with me. But yeah, other questions related to this? There's a so I like the Google suite of different stuff because it speaks really well to each other. It's free, though they're tracking all kinds of things about you. So is it free? But and I have heard that Microsoft actually has a lot more respect for privacy. So people like to hate multinationals, but they have all different kinds of goals. So you can choose what works best for you. But we've been using with Google and happy with it. Yeah.
So are you manually entering in that harvest data into your crop plan spreadsheet? How are you doing that?
You can use different formulas to bring information into other formulas. I don't have an example that can show everything integrated, but there's a formula called import range that you can take a sheet from something else. So you could, there's a couple of things you could do, okay? And we won't get too much into this for those of you who don't want to hear this kind of stuff, but in your crop plan sheet, you could have one of these tabs be the destination from the survey. So you could have, so that it just straight goes into there, and then within that sheet, you can have things referencing each other. Alternatively, and one of the challenges with that, sometimes it becomes very heavy. You have like 10 billion cells in here. Alternatively is you could have all the information going into another spreadsheet and have a pivot table or something in that sheet that's summarizing it into a smaller set of data that you're then importing into here. And then, so over here, okay. It's strange working with something that's not quite in front of me. There's different kinds of formulas, like here, we're using a SUMIF formula. I don't know if you can see that. So in the toolbar here, so it's a SUMIF. So looking at the crop plan tab in this row, we look to see if this word is here, everything that's there, we're going to sum together, and that's what gives this. So you could use something like that to link your harvest data in with your crop plan if you want to see what you actually produced for each of those. And so it's not that hard to do. I've kind of showed a simpler thing because it's just easier to teach that way. Our spreadsheets are really crazy and speak all kinds of ways to each other. But you do what's best for your farm. Yeah. Any other spreadsheety kind of questions?
Maybe one.
Yep.
For planning,
Yeah.
when you harvest, when you have the table for harvesting, it's everything you harvest, but not necessarily what you sell, right?
That's a fantastic segue. So, so glad you asked or mentioned. So, I didn't push F10, no? Okay. Okay. So, if you keep harvest records, use them. Then there's also sales records. And those are different than harvest records. So the harvest records, you harvest, you write everything in that you've harvested. And one place that can be tricky is, what if you choose not to harvest a bed because you don't have a market for it? And that's a really, like, if you can't sell something, don't harvest it. Now the exception might be that if you're going to sell stuff through the winter, you maybe got to harvest it in September or October. But if you have an extra bed of lettuce or two, you don't harvest it just on the hope that you can sell it later on. That's just labor that is not necessarily going to have a return and likely won't have a return. So you harvest, but what do you do in terms of records with that? And that's a tricky thing because it's giving your yield for that bed will come out pretty low if you didn't harvest it. And so the answer to that is you don't grow stuff you don't have a market for, and that's how you'll increase that yield. Now, in terms of sales records, you want to get, so harvest records is something that I'm trying to transmit some skepticism about, though they do have a lot of strength and they do have value. Sales records, I think you should fully embrace them. Sales records really tell you a lot about your business and the stuff that you really want to know about. And so invoice everything you sell. And that means that if you're using QuickBooks or Xero or FreshBooks, or if you have like a Shopify online store, everything that you sell, you want to get into that system, and that's how you look at it. Now, if you sell to grocery stores or you sell to restaurants, you need to make an invoice to get paid, so it's easy to do that. But when you sell at a farmer's market or when you sell your CSA, that's something that isn't always clear, or it doesn't always get into there. Now, if you have Square set up or a Shopify store set up, and you have the diligence to have like a cache on an iPad at your farmer's market, and you enter everything as it comes in, then that's all getting invoiced. You know, you get it all into your system, and that you can look at that data. But if you're just taking cash and mentally doing math, then what you can do is start off with a sheet that has the carrots, the crops you're bringing, what the format, the price, and then how much you started with. You write that before, and at the end of the day, you count what's left, and then you know what you sold by that simple mathematical formula. And then this is what you would invoice into your system. and you make sure that it's equal to the cash that you brought in. And does that make sense? Yeah. And so this information is what you can export or look at with different reports to see how your farm is doing. What's important to realize is this, at this point, it doesn't matter what bed you got these carrots from. They're coming from all over the place. This is just carrots. So it's less tied specifically to the production. Your harvest is tied more to a location, whereas this is just tied to a date. Yeah. And these are the information that you would analyze when you're starting your next marketing plan of figuring out what outlets were the most profitable for. And you can consider, how much work each one of them was versus each other. And then you can also figure out what crops you sold the most of. But this doesn't necessarily tell you which was the most profitable. For that, you might have to look at your harvest records. And so that's if you have the yields that you're looking at, that's how you can tell what some of this profitability is.
So mainly you use both for planning.
Yeah, you'd use both. Yeah, but this is what you're using. The sales records are a lot for your marketing plan, and the harvest records are more for your crop plan in general, though there's a piece of your harvest records that might be evaluating the profitability. If you go back to, at the beginning I said there's 5 metrics you can look at crop profitability. So how much you sold per acre, what you sold per, the dollars per acre, the dollars per harvest hour. There's the time in the ground, how hard it is to grow, and then can you sell it all? Those 5 things, the dollars per acre, that kind of ties into your harvest records. And now you can look at that dollars per acre in real time throughout the year, but once you know what comes out of a bed, you know that if a 100-foot bed of carrots, I can get 200 bunches, you can kind of make that, you can make that decision without having to have a whole spreadsheet to validate that. So, yeah, so in all these cases, you're going to use the records. So we're going to transition out of record keeping, unless anybody has last record keeping questions.
How do you track your harvest hours?
We track it in terms of rates. So there are some times that we'll put a little bit more work in figuring out how many labor hours go into harvesting a specific crop, and then we know what that rate is, and we kind of assume it when we're doing planning. You could have people just enter in the time that they spent, and then you can see that come in out of a harvest sheet. But I think that it's more important to understand the harvest rates and the yield rates than it is to actual real data, because the rates tell you kind of whether you're on or off a little bit. Does that make sense? Yeah.
But following that, on the different tasks, do you want to know how much time they spend in seeding or harvesting or making beds?
I would love to know that, but we have chosen to not have people log all the actions they do. It becomes a whole task for people to record that I started at 8 to 8:30 I did this, 8:30 to 9 I did this. It is beneficial. There's one year that we did a pilot for it, and we discovered that all our new staff logged all the hours they work. All the returning staff didn't. And it can be hard to throw a new task in. But also, we didn't do a lot with information afterwards. And so I think that you really have to be using that information. So when I talked about the garlic, that year, we kept, anytime anybody did anything with garlic, we kept track of it. We did the same thing with tomatoes and onions. And people knew that was part of the thing. It was easy to do. And then at the end of the year, we were able to say, look, this is how we spent our time in these crops. Did you know that 17% of our time, the whole time, was actually doing this? And we kind of think it's kind of useless, and then we're going to cut this out. And so if you're able to show your staff that tracking their time shows something, and that you're going to get rid of stuff that they don't like, or extra steps that don't make the farm money, I think that they're more willing to play along with it. But if it's just to get data, I think it's going to be less well accepted. Yeah. Okay, so we want to make our plan work. And That's the trick. So your crop plan is your guide. You know, this is what's walking you through the season. And you need to consult it all the time. So once you've built it, the building it is the harder part. The using it should be easier. And using it should make your life easier. So every Monday, you're looking at and putting on a board what you need to do for the week. And throughout the week, you're kind of checking on what you need to be do. You have to know that what actually happens isn't going to be the same as the plan. And that probably doesn't surprise anyone. That's not a reason not to plan. Because if you don't have if you don't even know what success looks like, it's hard to compare with where you're at. So as things change, you have to update your crop plan. And you have to, if you go through a period where all your seedlings in the greenhouse die, maybe of lettuce, maybe you choose that you're going to grow some extra carrots to replace it in the space that's in the field. So there's things that you can update in your crop plan as needed. Now, you got to share your crop plan with your team. Information that's in silos doesn't get used. So the more stuff that you can transmit, the better it is. And so I'd encourage you to share, if you have a document like what we have, share it with your team and let them have access to it. Now, you don't want them to change everything in it. That's going to make you unhappy. But you should be trusting your staff anyway. And it's good to have an accountability partner. What this means exactly can be up to you. But maybe it's who you're planning with, if your business partner or otherwise, or some of your staff. People should know that this is an important thing and that they should make sure that you're doing it and that you're looking at it, and that if you're not paying attention to it, call you out on it. And that's really important. And so over time, we'll come back to this in a moment. Okay. So those are great inspirational things to say. But how does that actually happen in real life? And things change. They change all the time. So what's something that might go wrong in the season that you hadn't planned for? Drought. Okay. So there's drought. What has gone wrong when there's a drought? Okay, there's no water or germination. Okay. What does that look like in your field?
Is death the wrong answer?
Death.
More money in irrigation.
More money in irrigation. Okay. But I guess what I'm fishing for. So what do your carrots look like in this drought year?
Loss of income.
Right, but so maybe there's less germination, you have less carrots, it's spotty germination. Carrots are lower quality, smaller. One thing that could be interesting is, I don't know about carrots, but sometimes stuff that's stunted tastes better. But that's not necessarily what you're thinking of when you're thinking of death. What's that? Yeah. But this is kind of what. So this is what happens, So this you're going to be missing carrots. You won't be able to fill your baskets. You're going to have chefs or whoever unhappy. When do you know this is a problem? Okay. When is it too late? Okay. So at harvest, when you need 200 bunches of carrots, and you pull out 37 bunches of carrots, that is too late to get those 200. 2 carrots per bunch, but they are good carrots. They've got personality. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, is there any way you could have known? Is it any surprise that there was only 37 bunches in that bed? Visually, there was these fantastic leaves on top. The bed was full. But when you pulled it out, there were the runtiest little things. So there's a good chance that you knew before harvest that wasn't a great bed. Okay? So let's say, what date did you see these carrots? May 10th, great date. Okay? When would you like May 10th carrots to be up by? Okay. But realistically, when can you expect it and be happy? Yeah. How many did somebody say? There's a lot of things. May 20th. Okay, I like that. So May 20th. Okay. And, you know, you're starting to see a little bit of greening coming up. Okay. When would you see that it's, you know, a carrot about this size? May 30th? June 5th? And so at this point, you know, you have a dense row, that's little carrots. They're not ragweed like people think sometimes. But so what did these carrots look like on May 30th? Was it a full row or was it a spotty row? Okay. And what percent germination was there, like on 1 to 10? Was it a 5 on 10? Okay, let's say 5. So 5 on 10 germ. That's fairly spotty. Okay. Did it get better? Probably not. Okay. I think this here is when you know you have a problem. Everything after this is not dealing with the problem. And so you go out with the Hefty G and you cultivate and you stress over the thing there's no water. This is the point where you might want to say, I need to seed more carrots. And then the question is, do you keep these carrots? 5 on 10? 2 on 10? Who would keep a 2 on 10? Okay, 5 on 10, it's not a 6, but it's not a 2. It might depend how many, is this your first planting? Have you had other plantings? Do you have other if you have 5 nice beds and 1 5 on 10, maybe you till this one in. This one is going to be work at a lot of different levels. And especially, like, maybe you are a flame weeding pro, and you got in and you flame weed on May 19th, and you've flushed everything else, and you had still seed bedded with your tines before. You've done all that, and there is no weeds in here. Maybe. But maybe there's a lot of weeds, and you have to go in and hand weed those. Do you want to hand weed a 5 on 10 3 times? That's all work that you're putting in for something that, if it is giving you 37 bunches instead of 200, all the labor you went into, you've lost money on this crop. There's no way that you made money on that crop. So I would strongly think about tilling this in at this point and replanting in the same spot. Or, though if you actually till it in, you're bringing weeds up. So you're actually creating a not perfect bed. But if you have another, maybe you put lettuce in there instead because it's going to be mature quicker and it's easier to harvest, and you put some carrots where you had some lettuce beds that had been already still seed bedded. But this is where you want to, this is the kind of thing that you need to think about. Because at this point, it's like you're just delaying the inevitable. And we had half an acre of onions that we should have tilled in around this point, you know. We tilled in half, but the other half, we just couldn't do it, and our staff still talks about it. And, yeah, and you could see them driving through the field and looking at it, and they weren't happy, you know. Yeah. What's another bad thing that might happen on your farm? Oh, let's not talk about the other bad thing yet. What could you have done differently? Irrigate, yeah. Why didn't you? Wasn't part of the plan. Dan didn't put a column that said irrigate on this date. Sometimes weather changes quickly.
I was thinking drought like, end of June.
Yeah,
They're sleepy and green and then they stop.
yeah. Well, okay, so that's a different situation at that point. But it kind of comes back to like, when do you, so I guess one thing is, do you have access to irrigation water? So that's, if you don't, how often do you have droughts? And if you have droughts regularly, why are you growing carrots? And it's a serious question. It's not a facetious one. It's a serious one. You got to choose the crops in function of what your regular weather patterns are. Your regular weather patterns are. There are all kinds of yes, your average, but there's abnormal things that happen, and you can have a year that, you know, we've had 2 years in the last 15 years where it just didn't warm up. You know, it would get to like, maybe it would get to the low 80s, but it just wouldn't go beyond that. And there wasn't much sun and a lot of rain, and things just don't grow. And those are very disappointing years. And we've built greenhouses in function of that, but that's not the standard year. So we have done some things to mitigate against that, but we don't plan constantly about that. More likely it's going to be too hot. But when we had our second year like that, we started to take it a little bit more serious than when we had just 1 year. So what are other things that you could do? So irrigation is something that you can do in the short term, but building up your organic matter is something that can make a difference. What are other things that you might do?
Don't plant so late.
Don't plant so late. Yeah, if it's pretty late, May 10th. How?
Last frost, here is April 15th.
Okay. Do people grow carrots in the middle of the summer here? Yeah. Okay. That's something. So there's a lot of. Okay, we'll come back to this irrigation. Who here doesn't have access to irrigation water? Is that the water that's a problem, or is it the equipment? The equipment? Okay. If water is accessible, I think investing in irrigation equipment will change your life. When you're starting off, there's a lot of things you can buy. There's a million things you can buy. People will keep wanting to sell you other things too. But what do you invest in? And so some people like to invest in tractors and a lot of equipment to till things and make and harvest things. Great. You do need some way that you're going to prepare the soil. Okay, you need something. But where I think the biggest investments that you want to look at is you want an irrigation system, because drought happens. Even in areas that tend to be wet, you will get a drought year eventually. And it's likely to happen more and more with the way the climate's changing. And then there's also, in your post-harvest, there's a cold room. Now, some people do harvest and ship right off the farm. Most of us don't. And having a cold room means that you can hold things and sell them later, you know. You said you have an extra 50 or 100 heads of lettuce, and Dan said till them in because you don't want to waste it. But you could also harvest it and put your cold room, and you could sell it the next week, because the next week you know you won't have any lettuce left over. So that's the other thing. And then these are the two places that I would probably invest in. I really like covered growing space. I don't know how important it is, but some people have talked about caterpillar tunnels that I've been chatting with here. But covered growing space. Now, for irrigation, it's not a solution. You know, get rid of any chance of rain falling on it. But in years that there's a lot of rain, this is a solution. This is a way to mitigate your season, and it's good to know what other growers do. But like where I am, I wouldn't grow tomatoes outside of a covered growing space. Eggplants and peppers, we can have success in the field. We do grow them under cover mostly, but tomatoes I wouldn't grow out. So these are three things I would think about that are the bigger expensive items. You want a wash station, but that's really a hose and a bucket. You know, I mean, it doesn't have to be much. Like, we renovated our wash station dramatically last year, and we basically cleaned out a bunch of bins and put 2 old tables down, and that was going to be our dry pack area. We just had a wet pack area, and people would do stuff that's dry, like with, you know, garlic or onions, kind of anywhere. And we realized if you give them a dedicated place, they'll be much happier, and the mess stays in one place. But it doesn't have to be that big, the wash station. And in terms of like ground prep and stuff, you know, you have a tractor and a tiller. Sure, you want to go low till. There's all kinds of other things you want, but you need just something to till it up. And once you have these things, then invest in other things. Because this is what's going to make you resilient. And that's, as farmers, we really should embrace resiliency. We know we want to get through the tough times and without burning out and too much stress. So, you know, you always have bad things that happen, but how you learn to plan for them and roll with them, well, how you learn to plan for them is great, but then how you learn to notice when the bad thing has happened and respond accordingly is very important. And the earlier that you can notice that bad thing, the least impactful it is. Sure, it's irritating to till in a bed of carrots or 5 beds of carrots that you did, but you'll be much happier down the line. Or if you did have 5 beds, maybe you till 4 beds in and you just keep 1 to minimize the amount of work, just so you have something that goes into it. Yeah. Any thoughts on some of this? So to summarize is pay attention. You know, you want to be prepared, and this is kind of preparation, but pay attention to what's happening. And when you see something, and this is going back to when I was talking, well, I'm not going to look at the slide, it's like 10 slides ago. When I said, what are records for? Records can be for learning about your yields or monitoring about your yields. And when you're monitoring your yields 4 months after the thing has happened, you have no way to respond. So that's why I don't think record keeping is a great way to learn what's actually happening in your field as it is. It's observation and paying attention, and also listening to your staff and what their comments are. If they're complaining about something, maybe you don't have to, like, ideally, once a week, you would walk your fields and look at everything and decide what needs to happen. Now, you might not always be able to do that, or it's possible there's 1 or 2 weeks you miss because it's just getting crazy. I would encourage you to still try to do it, but it can be hard. But you will hear your staff talking about stuff. They see things happening all the time, and pay attention to what they say. And if they say this area is problematic, go and look at it. And learn from your mistakes. If you hold on to these beds of carrots and they don't do so well, realize that you shouldn't do that again in the future. Yeah?
I was at another talk or conference, and similar to your survey,
Yeah.
they had a separate form set up that everybody had access to, and
Yeah.
they would use their phones.
Yeah.
What did I see that was wrong? And it was literally just a spot, and they would send it, and they could check to see, oh, there's a ton of pests in this field, but there was no pause, no forget. It was literally type it in, send that comment, and then go through it at the end of the day.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great thing. So I don't know if everybody heard, but having a form, like a Google form or another form that people can access on their phones, what did I see today? And they can write down, it's an open-ended question.
It was just something about, I don't know, something's off or whatever, and it was
Yeah.
like you could put what the crop, the location, and then it was just a box that you could just say.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. Yeah. I mentioned it loosely. I'm just going to mention it here. Another thing that down the line is really worthwhile is organic matter. This is something that people like Jean Martin and Neversink and Curtis Stone and all kinds of smaller farms, there's a lot of things different. They all tend to do salad greens, but they probably all have fairly decent organic matter. And you don't see that as much on larger farms because organic matter is expensive. But bringing in a lot of organic matter, and you're bringing in compost not for nitrogen, not for the fertility, but really for the organic matter. And soil with higher organic matter holds on to humidity better. It drains better, so it gets both drier and wetter, you know. And it holds on to nutrients better than something like just sandy soil. It's easier to work, and you know, roots grow better in it. So this is something that will make your farm more resilient. Somebody was telling me about some communities where they vacuum up the leaves and you have leaf mold that you can collect. Leaf mold is a fantastic thing. You said sometimes you find a shoe in there, but or a bottle of wine. If you have access to bulk amounts of organic matter that you trust, maybe you don't want those shoes and bottles of wine, but something that you trust, it's really worth, and if you're certified organic, you might have to ask very specific questions and get papers signed. But this is something that is beneficial to your farm. And I mean, there's a whole movement of a sort of type of no-till where really all they're doing is putting maybe the broad fork a little bit, but putting organic matter on and to mulch the compost on the top of the field to mulch their fields and then plant through that. Yeah.
What percentage would you shoot for?
100. I don't know if I have a recommendation of what to shoot for. I think it'll go up, but like, so it depends what kind of soil you have.
I have super sandy.
So if super sandy soil, so 5% is already something that's really amazing, you know. But in organic, I've seen organic clay soils that weren't going all to town on this that have 10 or 12% organic matter just by being careful of how they do stuff. Clay can build up organic matter a lot better with good management. But I don't know if I have a specific answer, but I think a lot of sandy soils are kind of like 2 to 4%, and you kind of just trying to maintain that. Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. Okay.
There's actually a website for the U.S. that you can look up the soil surveys they've done.
Yep.
And it covers the country, but you can get an estimation on organic matter in your area, or if you're looking for a farm, that kind of a thing. But
Yeah.
it's the soil survey.
Okay. Yeah. Is that something that's easy to find?
Yes.
Yep.
There are a lot of boxes you have to check, but I will see if I can look up the actual website. But it's just, I think it's the
Soil
USDA.
survey.
Is it?
Web soil survey.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we'll take a break in about 5 to 10 minutes. Okay. So over time, the process of crop planting changes. So if you're a newer farmer, how you sell, your marketing plan is kind of the most important. And you're trying to figure out what you can sell and then grow in function of that. As you become a more experienced farmer, your markets have been developed, and it becomes more about what you want to grow. And you start to choose the crops that you want to grow because you like them more, they're more profitable, they're easier, and you try to figure out how to sell those, either to the market that you're in or change your marketplace so you can find new markets that can meet that better. And you're really looking for a stable crop plan that doesn't bring big surprises, you know, that you've really mastered. And so that's kind of the evolution. That sound good? So the ultimate goal of crop planting is you're trying to get a farm that provides a good quality of life, and that's for you and it's for your staff. Lets you make a decent living as much as for your staff, and maintains and improves the agroecological system. We're trying to leave the world a better place than we got it, which is a big goal for crop planting. But this is what a good crop plan can build towards. And if your crop plan isn't going that way, you got to figure out, you know, to change your process. But starting with your goals of what you want to see, and then figuring out the market plan and the crop plan to get there is what's going to make this happen. If you don't start with where you want to go to, instead just kind of grow stuff and then try to sell it and then maybe make some money, you're not necessarily going to meet all these 3 goals. And so that's the end of my formal presentation. So thank you for listening to me so much. I have a blog where I write about seed and I write about small farming. You're welcome to read along. Yeah. And so what I thought we could do now is that we could take a break, and then we can come back and we can talk about the next things that we want to talk about. So maybe during the break, think about if there's specific questions that you haven't had answered. There's a couple things some people mentioned, but I'll talk definitely about crop rotation as one thing. But we still have something like, actually we're almost about like an hour and a half, 2 hours. So we're going to be able to answer the questions that you need answered. Okay. So thank you, and you're free for 15 minutes.